Oh boy, it's that time of year again, isn't it? So, most of the teams in the Overwatch League have finished their seasons. They are not taking part in the grand finals that are comprised of the Shanghai Dragons, the Seoul Dynasty, San Francisco Shock, and Philadelphia Fusion. So, they are now looking to 2021, when they are going to try and rebuild their rosters or change a few things to make them one of the better teams in the league and give them a shot at winning the league entirely. Now, some teams have a lot more work to do than others. So, the work has started. We have seen changes at Chengdu Hunters in their coaching lineups. We've seen actually a move at the NYXL in their coaching lineup as well. But this week we have seen the biggest change in a coaching lineup so far, and you won't get much bigger than what the London Spitfire have been doing. So, we need some background story, don't we? Right, London Spitfire have not had the best season in 2020, have they? So, the previous years before that, 2018, they were champions with their Profit roster, the original London Spitfire roster that was made up of Chengdu Panthera and GC Busan. And they were two massive rosters in Korea. They came together to fuse this massive London Spitfire roster that was very, very hyped because of the amount of quality it had. And we saw Profit and Birdring, Gesture, Fury, all of these fantastic players molded to make the London Spitfire. Of course, there were a few players dropped along the way, the likes of Fisher and also Huyol, who are still around, but not as prominent as the old London Spitfire players were. They came through in 2018, finished 5th, won it all in the end in that grand final against Philadelphia Fusion. But in 2019, it wasn't as plain sailing for the UK roster, was it? I say UK roster, it was all Korean. So they kept a lot of the people on. They maybe offloaded a few, and they brought in some additions like Krillin mid-season and Guard. And Krillin was sort of the precursor to what we would expect from London in 2020. So London don't do all that well in 2019. They finish 7th in the league, I believe, something like that. And then they end up going into the play-ins. They get past the play-ins fairly well, and they actually had a real barnstorm of a game against Shanghai in those play-ins. They go into the playoffs, and basically they got bodied. I believe, first of all, by the New York Excelsior 3-1, and then they take on the San Francisco Shock in the losers bracket, where the San Francisco Shock were just, they had just lost to the Atlanta Reign in really bad circumstances, and they just rolled the rest of the bracket. London got 4-0'd. So they never won a game in those playoffs, and it wasn't great. So at that point, London blow up. And most of their coaching roster had changed by this point. Only Agape remained. They released everyone apart from Krillin and Agape, basically. And this meant a lot of great players moved around the league. We saw Gesture, Profit, Badosin, they go over to Seoul Dynasty. We see Fury go over to the Philadelphia Fusion, their 2018 rivals. And everyone's very questionable about the London Spitfire and what's going on. But then we see big moves. They end up signing the NYXL head coach Pavane to work side Agape. That's a big move from London in that off season. And then they bring in this kind of unknown roster, bringing in a lot of unknown talent. We don't really know what's going to do in the Overwatch League. We knew some of them, like Banar and Fuse, who had been on Fusion University prior to that, before they had moved to the Korean region to become T1. But we didn't know a lot of these players, like Sanguinar and people like that. We didn't know how they were going to do. Glista was another one we knew about as well. And Shui had time run away. And it hasn't really worked out for London this season. There were glimpses of great quality in this London squad, and there were great performances from the likes of Glista and Banar, even Sanguinar at times. Sanguinar, I believe, was one of the great finds from this London team in 2020. He was on the 3rd or 4th level of Genji's Academy, Gen S or Gen A. I can't remember which one it was, or maybe Gen B. Genji have got a lot of academies under that Seoul Dynasty, flagship, and he was a great find, I think. And there's obviously Hailey. He was the only one with Overwatch League experience coming from the Seoul Dynasty. And it hasn't gone well for London. They finished bottom of APAC. They finished well down the league. Worst finish in their history. And we regarded this as a building season for this team. And what would happen next season would be the real test of this might of the London Spitfires roster. They were in a very, very tough region as well, not to forget. They started the season out pretty well, taking New York close at their own homestand. getting wins against the Florida Mayhem, Washington Justice, and Houston Outlaws in narrow fashion when that team was very, 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 very new. So that was a great start for London Spitfire in 2020, but then it just went downhill from there when everything blew up with COVID. And then London got put in APAC and they were never able to reclaim any of that hype that they had. So now we come to the end of the 2020 season. It is now October, and London Spitfire have got nothing to play for. It is the end of their season, and it's now time for them to have their off-season. Now, I expected London to tinker around a little bit, and maybe add a few, maybe release a few, but I thought they would keep going with this idea of building this roster and this new idea that they were having, this creation of, not a dynasty, that's the wrong idea, but this creation of very young talent and building them up and making them a team that can last. However, it appears I was wrong. It appears we were all wrong. So, this was an exclusive in the Esports Observer on September the 30th. London Spitfire in the process of releasing entire roster and coaching staff. Overwatch League team, the London Spitfire, is currently in the process of releasing or trading its entire roster and the entirety of its coaching staff from the previous season, according to what sources close to the organisation have told the Esports Observer. Sources say that while some of the players and staff have already been released, negotiations are still ongoing as it relates to the trading or releasing of others. Spitfire is owned by Cloud9 and we carry on. So this was a report and it was suggested. Now, there's no reason to not believe the Esports Observer. They've also said that Pete Velaz-Telica, who is the Overwatch League commissioner, is stepping down. And I think that's also going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if John Spector takes up that role, because really he's been the face of the league. We haven't seen Mr. Velaz-Telica, have we? So, Anyway, back to London Spitfire, because this is the issue in hand here. And so this is an interesting story, and we have no reason to discredit it. But then, 1st of October comes around. Spooky month starts off with spooky stuff. London Spitfire officially announced them releasing their entire coaching staff. So this is Agape, Pavane, Twinkle, and Skix. This is a big move. And this clearly indicates to me that the Esports Observer was completely correct in what they were saying. So, Pavane, obviously, this is not great for him coming off being head coach at New York Excelsior, being so consistent with them, and then the London Spitfire have not lived up to that. Agape, he was the only remaining champion in the London Spitfire team. All the players are gone, all the coaching staff are gone. Agape was the only one remaining, but he is now gone as well. This means that there is a lot of coaching talent, especially between Agape and Pavane, who know each other very well. There's a coaching duo if anyone wants them there. If teams are looking for them, maybe Dallas Fuel, just saying. If their team's looking for coaching staff, Agape and Pavane would be probably on their lists. I would not be surprised. Anyway, back to London, and this leaves London decapitated, basically. No coaching staff remain at that team. Zilch. Nothing. And it just leaves them with that 12-man roster that they've been going with this season. And I fully expect this entire roster to go. Now, obviously this means Krillin, Banar, Fuse, Glister, Shui, JMac, Hyleague, Sanguinar, Babel, Celestin, Orzo, and Jihan. They will all be leaving, I would have thought. I don't want to see them all leave, to be honest. Now, we will get back to where these guys go. I mean, we can say, first of all, Glister, I think he deserves an Overwatch League team. Without a doubt, I think Glister deserves an Overwatch League team. I can say the same for Banar. And I think I can say the same for Hyleague as well. I think Hyleague is a really good player. As for the others, I'm not too sure. Babel looked great on the Widowmaker at times, so he could be another one that gets a place. But Glister, I wouldn't be surprised to be picked up. I could see him going somewhere like Sol. I wouldn't be surprised. But that's sort of a discussion for elsewhere. The question is, where do the London Spitfire go from here? Now, the Esports Observer said this, and I fully believe this. As soon as I saw this news, I didn't even read the article. As soon as I saw London were going complete blow up, I thought this would happen. There has been a little bit of a revelation going on in Europe, European Contenders to be specific, and this is British Hurricane. So British Hurricane is the academy team of the London Spitfire, and they have been doing wonders in European Contenders. They are unbeaten this year through Season 1 of European Contenders and now currently Season 2 of European Contenders as well. They are doing so well. Massive domination in Europe. And no one has been able to take their crown. And they could honestly be one of the best contenders teams in the world right now. They would have to go up against the likes of O2 Blast and people like that in Korea, Runaway, obviously the likes. But I honestly think they're better than any NA team right now, which is pretty darn crazy because we haven't said that about EU much. So now, the wide consensus is, including the Esports Observer saying this, that London Spitfire and Cloud9 are going to promote the British Hurricane roster to the London Spitfire. Now, this would be the biggest change in London's philosophy ever. This is not just them moving to a development roster in their main roster, this is them moving to a European roster, a non-Korean roster, for the first time ever. And there are reasons this would work, there are reasons where this wouldn't work. So, you've got to judge where British Hurricane are at right now. Now, there is a few things that may get in the way of the Hurricanes' promotion, shall we say. One is their DPS player, Sparker. So, Sparker is Swedish DPS player, phenomenal player. He's been playing alongside Danad for the British Hurricane, and they've been ripping things up. But Sparker is only 17, and he won't have a birthday until June the 10th. So, he won't be old enough to play in the Overwatch League to start off with. So, if they promote British Hurricane, which is a 6-person roster, they would not have enough players. So it is impossible for them to start off with just the British Hurricane lineup. Also, 6 players does not meet the demands of the Overwatch League for the amount of players on a roster. So, there's stuff to work on here for the Spitfire. It cannot just be British Hurricane. Obviously, they do have the coaching staff there. They have Fisher as a head coach, who was a great player as well. Albion as an assistant coach and Commander X as an assistant coach as well, so they could be straight up promoted. There are other options for the Spitfire though, and let's talk through them now. I've given this some thought. I'm a Spitfire supporter, so I've given this some thought, I should say. Talking of support, the 2 supports for this British Hurricane lineup are Ripper, who actually had time at the Los Angeles Gladiators, and Kellox, who had time at the Toronto Defiant and Boston Uprising, when Boston Uprising were really good in the inaugural season. So this Hurricane roster also has some experience going for it. But, because this Hurricane roster would not be complete enough for an Overwatch League roster, then the Spitfire would have to make additions to it. What would they do? So, there are some options. There are Vancouver Titans, right? And there are suspicions that Shockwave is leaving the Vancouver Titans. Would London be able to lure him? It is possible. There are other options. Will London try and go down the route of signing up some of the old Team UK boys? It wouldn't be a surprise. So, could they lure Fusions away from the Boston Uprising? I'm sure Fusions would leave the Boston Uprising for London. I mean, he's at Boston. So, there's that option. Kib doesn't play Overwatch anymore, so that's not an option. But when you look at other players, Numlocked is in the Overwatch League right now. I'm not sure London would pick him up, but he's an option. KSP of the Valiant, would he really be lured to play for his home team? It's possible. KSP's a London lad, I believe. And they're not going to lure Funny Astro. That's the only British player that I don't think London can lure. So it's possible that they start adding these British components to them. They pick up Crews, they pick up Fusions, they pick up Smex maybe from the Paris Eternal, considering he's had some health issues and he hasn't paid for Paris. I don't think he's going to play for Paris, so he's not going to start over Hambin. So would he move to London? I think he would. So there are options here where London move to a hybrid of the British Hurricane Team GB roster, or Team UK roster, and it becomes a massive European promo team. It would be massive for Cloud9 and London Spitfire to become the face of Europe in the Overwatch League, and it is very, very possible that they do that. When you look at the moves that Paris Eternal have made, when the Paris Eternal were first formed, they were a French team. A lot of French talent on there alongside a lot of European talent. But now they have moved to an all-Korean coaching lineup. They've moved to a lot more Korean influence like Xe, like Sparkle, like Hanbin, like NoSmite, like Fielder. There's a lot of Korean influence in that Paris Eternal lineup now. And it did pee some Paris Eternal fans off when they went down that route. Would they be tempted to support a London Spitfire team that was all European? It is possible. So that's where London could go and become a big promo team for Europe. And honestly, with that lineup, I think they could be middle of the league. I don't think they're going to do anything extraordinary, but I think they would be better than they were this season, especially when the likes of Fusions would be in their comfort zone with players that are absolutely fantastic. And then you've got Kellogg's, Reaper, Molfig, Haddy, Sparker, and Danad from the British Hurricane as well. Danad and Sparker have been fantastic on DPS. There are other options to fill these spots. It wouldn't fill the DPS slot that is a slight issue for the Spitfire right now, unless they do something pretty interesting, which I don't think they're going to be able to. But there are 2 players on the London Spitfire current roster that has not been released yet, that's probably going to get released. There are 2 players that have worked on a mixed roster before. These would be Banar, the off-tank player, which has actually probably been one of the best players for the Spitfire this season, and obviously Fuse as well. They were the 2 players that came to London Spitfire from the Fusion University, the team that dominated NA contenders back a year ago. Just like British Hurricane are dominating EU contenders right now. Fusion University back then were unbeatable. They really, really were. So, could London sign British Hurricane and keep Banar and Fuse? That's another option. That would bring them over the qualification limit for the amount of players you have to have in the Overwatch League. It still, however, doesn't sort their DPS problem. They would still need a hit scan DPS. So, the 2 hit scans they have really, right now, are Babel and Glister. 2 players who have always been on Korean rosters. So I don't expect them to stay. I don't expect London to be able to keep Glister, to be quite honest. I don't think Glister will want to work in a mixed roster. And if he does, that could actually be massive for the Spitfire. But I don't expect it. I really don't expect it, considering there probably won't be any Korean coaching staff either. So, London is going to be very interesting to keep an eye on during this off-season. You need to be expecting them to pick up the British Hurricane roster. The entire roster to be promoted. But they will have to sign others. Because they will have to sign additions to that, because they won't have enough to meet league rules. They also will have to sign a hitscan DPS player, while Sparker will be ineligible because of his age. So, there's a lot of unknowns still with this London Spitfire roster going into 2021, but it's going to be a very different London Spitfire than what we have seen, perhaps ever. So, yeah, this is a team to really keep an eye on. Will they give perhaps some people that have been on British Hurricane before their chance at the Overwatch League, like Hafakul comes to mind immediately. Hafakul is an off-tank player. He went to Team Envy after being at British Hurricane, and Hafakul was a great player. He's played alongside Fusions as well. So, there's a lot of opportunities for London Spitfire here, but this is going to be one hell of an off-season in London. And, oh boy, we could be seeing a very different looking London Spitfire. And I'm not going to lie, they're probably not going to be a great team. They're not going to be a top 6. They may surprise, but if it's this Hurricane roster, I think they'll do decently. Also, as a Spitfire fan, I'm kind of hyped to see a European London Spitfire. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be, look, you've seen mixed rosters like the Philadelphia Fusion work. So why can't London Spitfire make it work? Why can't they use Banar and Fuse alongside British Hurricane and maybe a few other additions and make a mixed roster work? It is possible. It's going to be an interesting off-season, but this is the first dedicated video to an individual team, and I get the feeling there's probably going to be quite a few more. But I'm going to leave it here for this one. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you'd like to give a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.